Okay. Hey everyone. I am Danny Zhang. I'm the managing mosaic editor at the review. Um, Nadia, did you want to introduce yourself now?
Hi, everyone. My name is Nadia Ellerhorst. I am Associate Mosaic Editor at The Review. Spoiler alert, it's the movie review, but seriously, we will be discussing important plot elements of major films, so we recommend you watch these movies beforehand for optimal enjoyment of our chatter. While we'll try our best to summarize, it's difficult to do the complicated plots of these films justice with limited time. That's Wikipedia's job. So we'll be focusing more on themes and specific plot points. This is our very first time doing a podcast, so we really appreciate you taking the time to listen to a couple of random college students who aren't studying film discuss cinema. And our first episode will be the first part of a series in which we discuss the themes of money in film. In this episode, we take an in-depth look at the general themes of wealth and inequality in cinema. So Danny is kind of going to be leading us today, as most of the films on this list he's seen. I'm just here for the ride, to be honest. So Danny, how would you like to start off?
Yeah. So I think that when I think of money in movies, I think it's natural to jump straight towards the movies that focus more on like the financial sector of things, or movies that might just be about poor people in general and like the lives that they live, which can often be a little uh, pornographic in a way, in that people are just like watching people be miserable. When I think of money in movies, I think of um, different genres per se. One of the things that comes to mind is disaster movies, which I really enjoy watching, even if they're bad, because they always are just deeply strange in one way or another. The first one that I have on this list is 2012, which was made in, I believe, 2009. Yeah, so 3 years before it was supposed to happen, it being the Mayan apocalypse that was predicted. It unfortunately did not happen, although I was somewhat convinced that it would happen. I was at least a little bit afraid that it would happen. And then that night when it was supposed to happen, December 21st, if I am not mistaken, when I saw that New Zealand was okay, I knew that we would also be okay. But nonetheless, it made for a very interesting movie that I watched with my dad on TV. We did not see it in theaters. Directed by Roland Emmerich, who's like probably the quintessential disaster movie maker, at least nowadays, maybe. And so it's a strange movie. It's got a really weird cast. John Cusack is the protagonist. He's like a limousine driver, like a divorced dad who's just trying to like reconnect with his kids, um, and also deal with the apocalypse that causes a chain of natural disasters. Um, and like other cast members, it's so weird. Danny Glover is the president. Woody Harrelson is this random guy who lives in an RV who like broadcasts conspiracy theories. Special effects are really good. But some of what interested me about the movie and why I wanted to discuss it is that it's very like deeply aligned with the kind of theory that rich people kind of have, like automatically these plans for when the world does end in this fashion or in any fashion maybe. Turns out that there's been like secret plans to build, I think it was three arcs, like Noah's Ark, that would carry off, you know, some segment of humanity that happened to be rich enough to buy tickets, and then like a whole, like literally Noah's Ark of like animals, like a few of each species, and then like of course, paintings and sculptures deemed worthy enough. And so, part of the plot of John Cusack, he's a driver for this like Russian oligarch, and so the oligarch has a way to like get onto the boat. John Cusack doesn't. So he winds up trying to like get the oligarch to the boat and then trying to like get his family onto the boat. So I don't know. It's like a really strange, like kind of like journey to like class um, mobility in a way in the context of the Mayan apocalypse. And it's like a strange, like, I don't know, it's like a very sobering movie in a way, not just because, like cities are leveled, but like just the way in which it shows, like there's one scene, I don't know, Nadia, I think you said that you watched a few clips. There's one scene where they're actually at the boat and like it's like one of those like kind of like drawbridge type doors. And so there are like people like trying to get onto the doors as they're like raising up and closing. And so people are like scrambling towards it. And it was pretty like distressing to watch. When this was 2009, so I would have been like, shoot, when was I born? 1999. I would have been 10 at the time, 10 or 11. Um, so, it was pretty distressing to watch. But yeah, I don't know if you had any thoughts on like disaster movies like that you've seen per se, maybe.
Yeah, I'm not big on disaster movies. You're right. I did watch like two clips from 2012, and I don't I don't know. I was kind of finding myself a little more curious as to how much money they actually spent on the special effects, because it's just some very massive chaotic scenes of destruction that, like, I don't know. The movie, the parts I saw weren't my favorite, but I got to give it to the special effects crew. Like, they did a really like striking job of just depicting like the end of the world. I also just found the prospect of escaping Los Angeles in a limo just a little strange. I wasn't expecting that when I just found the random clip online. It's I'm like tempted to watch it, even though disaster movies aren't really my thing, just based on what you've said, but I don't know if I could handle it based on what you sound like. It sounds super intense.
It's mostly stupid, honestly. Like I enjoy it a lot more than I should. I've seen it like 3 times, I think now. Anytime it comes back onto a streaming service, I usually end up watching it. It's just like you said, like the limousine escaping LA is just weird. I remember at one point, they drive, or no, they were either in the limousine or in a plane that they found on an airfield. Um, but they wind up like going through a skyscraper as it falls. I think it had to have been the limo because I remember them driving like through an office building, like a floor of an office building, and out the other side. And so, like there are people like left and right falling into these like cracks in the earth because it's like I think it's the San Andreas fault line. And so like that's part of the thing. Like 2012, it's not just an apocalypse. It's like every conceivable natural disaster happens. So it's like San Andreas and then the Yellowstone supervolcano. That's what takes out Woody Harrelson. Um, and yeah, it's just very weird. I think a lot of the disaster movies tend to like prey upon people's anxieties about like things that are out of their control. And 2012, I think, does a really like strangely good job of incorporating like class into it in like a very dumb and straightforward and unsubtle way. But I think there's something to be said about like the value of no subtlety in movies. I think for every, you know, Oscar nominated, and I think when people say Oscar nominated as like a way to like make a movie sound pretentious, I think it's annoying. But like I think there's something to be said for like the value of those kinds of movies, where it's like very like subtle and like careful with its themes, and then like the value of movies by Roland Emmerich or James Cameron's Avatar, where it's just like we're like telling you what this movie is about, and like if you don't get it, then you are kind of like a rock, like unable to like grasp like simple concepts. But so yeah, I don't know. Like 2012 is one of those movies that I think is good at what it does. Like you said, the special effects, like they've aged like pretty well. It's still like it's not. I don't love watching those like CGI movie fests where it's like, you know, the only real things on the screen are like the actors. I think those can get a little tiring to look at after a while, but I think 2012, like at a certain point, if they go hard enough with it, it just becomes like fun to look at, and it just like kind of like dulls your senses. And like it kind of like dulls your senses in a way of like themes too. Like you're just looking at it and you're like, man, rich people are bad, and like and yeah, it just kind of like does. It's like a very strange movie, but it's one that I enjoy, and it's one that I think of whenever I think of money in movies, because I think it's like a strangely present theme in it, just money and class. I think the next movie on my list, it was a little more subtle. It was kind of like the opposite direction in a way. 2012 was like very much fueled by the story. Like it was just like a nonstop journey from point A to point B, and like John Cusack was like totally like inconsequential to the story. Like you could have replaced any character in the movie with a different actor, and it would have been the same thing. This next movie, which I watched, I think over winter break, the Towering Inferno. Even the name is cool to me. It was directed by Irwin Allen, who I don't think I had seen any movies by before. I didn't even recognize his name, honestly. But the score is by John Williams, which I thought was pretty cool. And it is a one of those like I didn't even really know it. I had saved after I watched it. I wound up saving a bunch of like posters to my camera roll just because they were so fun to look at. There was like a whole disaster movie genre in the 70s and probably the 80s. And then you could there are disaster movies all the time, but in the 70s there was like a particular brand of like star-studded like just character actor disaster movies where it's just like something bad happens and that's the whole plot of the movie, and you just see like these famous actors and actresses just react to it. And so this one, it has Steve McQueen and Paul Newman are the leads in it. William Holden and Faye Dunaway are in it too. Um, and so that McQueen and Newman are kind of like the two co-leads of the movie, and they do an interesting thing on the poster for it, which I'm looking at now. Obviously, they kind of like hold equal weight as like big important movie stars, and so the poster, you know, like billing on a poster is pretty important in terms of like how the stars have their contracts negotiated by their agents, and so both of them I would say deserve first billing in any movie that they're in. Well, depending on who they're in it with, which in this case, they're in it with each other. And so on the poster, you can see that Steve McQueen's name comes first from the left, but Paul Newman's name comes first from the top. So depending on what way you look at it, both of them have top billing. That doesn't really have anything to do with money in movies. That's just an interesting tidbit. I guess you could say it has something to do with money behind movies, because both of them have enough clout to throw their weight around and get that kind of thing on the poster. But anyways, the movie, the tagline on the poster I'm looking at is just cool in and of itself. One tiny spark becomes a night of blazing suspense. The subtitle, the tallest building in the world is on fire. You are there with 294 other guests. There's no way down. There's no way out. And I like the way that it kind of like places you in the action. And this is more of a tangent, but I like when posters are actually like creative and like involving you in it. Anyways, so as you could probably guess from the tagline, it's about a burning building that people are trapped in. The title really says it all, honestly. It's like this brand spanking new skyscraper, 294. No, that's the number of guests. I forget how many floors it has. I know it's a couple hundred. It's a lot of floors. And like more floors than I would argue is necessary for any building to have. But that's besides the point. And so it's this cast of characters, all who have like something to do with the building. Steve McQueen plays the fire chief who gets called in to rescue the people inside. Paul Newman plays the architect who he's not at fault for the building being on fire. He is very angry about it though, because he gave like his plans, which were like, perfect plans to the contractors who actually built the building. One of them was in charge of like the electricity through the building, and so the impetus, the spark, if you will, for the fire is that electrician. Like he wasn't an electrician per se, but he was like the contractor in charge of them. He deliberately cuts costs by kind of like cutting corners on the safety plans that Paul Newman laid out. And so, there's like faulty wiring and not enough like safety checks done on the system. And so, lo and behold, there's a fire. And so it quickly like takes over the whole building, and or at least, it was kind of interesting how they did it. Like it takes over like, the upper several floors towards the top, but not the very top, where at the very top there's hundreds of guests having like an opening party, so they're cut off from the bottom. It was an interesting movie. My parents, I like told them I was watching it, and they got all excited because I remembered seeing it when they were younger, like around my age. So yeah, I don't know, Nadia. I know you don't really watch disaster movies as much. Does this sound like something that you would be interested in?
I mean, I only know Paul Newman truly from like his sauce, like the dressings, Newman's
Mm.
Own. I see in the grocery store. So like that's really a bad thing to admit. I know he's a very famous actor, but I thought it really interesting how you mentioned the whole plot centers around the fact that someone cut corners in like the safety design of this building, because it just brings up the question of why would you do that if it's going to end up in more like financial loss in the end. It just seems a little counterintuitive to me personally, but that just sounds like a really interesting example of like, sounds like an interesting blend of like action, adventure, and disaster based on what you've said. Is that accurate, Danny?
Yeah, like Steve McQueen and Paul Newman. It was actually kind of like heartening. They formed like a kind of a deep friendship through the movie, where they're both like trying. They both kind of like morph into like action movie stars. Like they're like performing these like superhuman feats of like rescuing people in distress, and like kind of like combing through the floors and stuff. Um, like it doesn't like portray them as like the only good guys necessarily. Like there's a whole bunch of firefighters who get called in, but yeah, it does like this weird thing where it becomes like, as you say, like an action adventure movie, but in the context of a disaster movie. And like I think the disaster movie genre is big enough to fit movies like this in. I kind of like it when people expand the disaster movie genre to like, just like thing goes wrong to like great extent in a movie, which you could like classify a lot of movies as. I think that you could classify like Jurassic Park as a disaster movie, or Jaws even as a disaster movie. I think there's a lot of directions you can go, and I think that a lot of disaster movies are in some part defined by that kind of like cutting corners, like the like too big to fail kind of excuse, where like you said, like, obviously if something goes wrong, the financial costs will be much, much bigger than like if they had actually like designed things accordingly. And in this case, it was just like a very like greedy guy who like winds up, it was towards the end of the movie, which obviously kind of spoiler, but it's a very funny scene to me. The firefighters wind up rigging this contraption where they're on like a building nearby, and they have like a kind of zip line kind of thing connected to the elevator, which is at this point kind of like dangling off the side of the building, because it's one of those like, I don't really know if like they use them anymore. One of those like side of the building entirely elevators that's on the like the outside, which is just insane to me for many reasons. But So it's like a bunch of people who are trapped in there, and so they wind up like rigging this line to the roof of the other building, and it's this like little like seat thing that the people sit in, and then like kind of like slide down to the other building. And so of course like the electric contractor guy, like he's super greedy, and so he winds up like pushing a guy off the seat like to his death. Like he like falls from like hundreds of stories up, and the guy like the greedy guy like gets on the seat, and then like more people are like mobbing it because they're all like trying to get on, so they all wind up falling. And so like it's like a shot of like the guy like falling hundreds of feet from the hundreds of floors from up in the air. It was kind of like a satisfying end to his presence in the movie, because he was just a very annoying person. Like the McQueen and Newman like were always getting very mad at him for like what he did. And like even like another angle of like the money in the movie was the building was supposed to be like some kind of like hallmark of like human ingenuity, like the tallest building in the world, or at least in the country. And part of like when things started to go wrong, when the fire started, part of the building's like I guess touted characteristic was that it could be contained relatively safely. And like the owner of the building was like telling his party guests, he was like, so there is a fire a few floors down, but we are safe up here because the firefighters are containing it. And like to some degree, like yes, that could be possible, and like it's not good to like panic them altogether. But like what winds up happening is McQueen like tells them, okay, like you need to leave because we can't contain this. And so the owner is like, oh, I don't want to, because he doesn't want to like look bad in front of like all of his investors and like the mayor of the city. Um, and so it's all this like a lot of it is like that kind of like egocentric greed, like that kind of too big to fail mindset combined with that kind of like saving face desire, where none of them wanted to like admit their role in anything that happened. Poor Paul Newman was just trying to like go on a vacation with his girlfriend, but here he has to like deal with this burning building. Um, but that's life. So yeah, I don't know if you had any concluding thoughts on that. I know like for these last two movies, I've been kind of like talking at you. I don't know if you had any thoughts on like that kind of like genre as a whole, or that kind of like concept.
I mean, honestly, you seem like an expert, so it's very hard to follow up all these very insightful comments you're making. I think you've really got it down. I don't think I have anything to add, to be honest, since disaster isn't my niche. But I'm kind of curious about these films now, so like maybe I'll give them a watch, even though they sound kind of intense.
So now I was thinking that I might discuss next the films of Kelly Reichert, who is one of my favorite directors. I discovered her in quarantine last year. Um, Quarantine was a deeply movie fueled time for me. I watched more movies last year than I'd ever watched in any year before, and I owe that to boredom and quarantine, because my classes just dropped off the face of the earth. And I do miss early quarantine, not for the bad things that were happening in the world, but for having more free time during the spring than I've ever had before in my life. Well, since I was like a kid. But anyways, I digress. So I watched a lot of movies, and part of that was I watched all the feature films of Kelly Reichardt, which there are only, I believe, seven or eight. I think I listed most of them on this. We're looking at a Google Doc with the movies we want to discuss, by the way. Um, yeah, so I watched them all. I liked all of them. I didn't care for one of them, which I think was their first feature film. It wasn't like as interesting to watch for me. But anyway, I'm only going to talk about the ones I like, because I can like say the most about them. But since there are several of them, I'm not going to go like super in depth over all of them, because I think you can like talk more generally about like the through line that kind of like unites them all, which is, money and class and capitalism and how those things impact our relationships with people. Um, so I guess, it might make sense. I've kind of forgotten which order of release there is for all of them. So I think it might make more sense to like go through like what I remember to be the order I watched them in. The first one was Old Joy, which I think that was 2006. Not when I watched it. I would have been too young for it. That was when it was made. So Old Joy, it's like a pretty short movie, honestly, 1 hour, 16 minutes, which, as I always say, the movie should be less than 90 minutes or more than 3 hours. I think anything in between is just kind of like cowardly to some extent.
I
Um,
really disagree with that statement, but I'm sorry,
no,
I just
no,
wanted to
no,
add something.
no.
But
Explain your point of view because I'm
I
interested now.
I've just seen like 2 hour movies. Like the first one that popped into my head, which we're hopefully going to discuss in our next episode, was Aliens. That thing was over 2 hours long, but it was not 3 hours. And I tell you what, that was the most exciting approximate 2 hours of my life. I think time can play a major factor in how good a film is. You can have it too long or too short, but I'm not sure if your equation, however you devise that sort of number you just came up with, is correct. So please continue to talk at me.
No, 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 no. It's mostly just me like being annoying. I just so much of my consumption of movies comes down to what I feel like in the moment, and I think it's harder now that we're back in like at college or attending classes because some of us aren't physically here. I am, but that's besides the point. It's harder now to like budget movies into my schedule, especially at night when I just get so tired so early because I'm just an old man. Um, so it's easier to watch like a 90-minute movie or something during the week, but then on the weekends, like I kind of want something more substantial. And sometimes just I think the most annoying runtime is like 2 hours and 15 minutes because it's like too long to like fit in like a weeknight, but it's not long enough to be like a nice, satisfying afternoon watch. But like none of this has anything to do with what this episode's about. That was just like an aside. So anyway, so back to Old Joy. Old Joy is a movie about basically it's about these two friends in their 30s, um, or approximate 30s, who are going on like kind of a weekend camping trip, and just like I think it's just actually like for a night. They just go camping for a night, and they haven't seen each other in a while, and so it kind of like deals with their changing relationship and stuff. But it just really like kind of struck me in a way. It was a very like tender movie that both dealt with like male friendship and also like kind of like the obligation of it all, like the obligation of life and stuff. They're like during the scenes where the lead character, played by Daniel London, he, well, not lead, they're both leads, but he's kind of like the point of view character. He's like who you enter the movie seeing. And he's like driving, and it's just like the radio playing, talking about like, Democrats and Republicans and like congressional deals and stuff. And it's just very like claustrophobic in a way. And then the rest of the movie takes place in the woods with this very like I don't even know if there was a score. No, I think there was, but it was a very like low key score that used a lot of like nature sounds and stuff. So it's very comforting movie to watch. But I think part of the reason I thought it could like fit into money because like I said, Kelly's movies have like a through line through them all about like our relationship with money and I think more broadly like obligations and stuff about money. Um, I think Old Joy was like kind of like an early attempt by her at like getting to what it means to like exist outside of that. Once they like get out to the campsite, there's like no trace of what they had before, other than, their relationship to each other, which is kind of like not estranged friends, but friends who haven't seen each other in a while, and they're like kind of like displaced from each other, mentally. His friend Mark, who's played by Daniel London, his friend Kurt, who's played by Will Oldham, who is also a folk music artist named Bonnie Prince Billy, I think. Um, his music's good. I recommend it. But um, he, like Kurt, is like much more like lackadaisical, which I don't know if I've ever used that word before, but it kind of like feels cool using. It like he's much more carefree, like never really like grew out of like a free spirit mindset. Not to say that that's something you need to grow out of. While Mark is like, like his wife is expecting, and he has like, responsibilities and stuff. And like at the start of the movie, his wife's kind of like annoyed with him for like going out on this weekend trip when like, she's expecting like soon. And so, which is like, like makes sense to be annoyed with. Um, and so, like it doesn't, like the movie doesn't really like mention money really at all, as I can remember. But I think it kind of like touches on it like spiritually almost. I don't know. It connected with me very deeply when I saw it, because early quarantine when I did see it, I was feeling very like obligated by it all. Like like I don't use that word correctly on purpose. Like I think I'm kind of like making it into a new word, like kind of like weighed down by a lot of stuff. But yeah, her other movies have much more to do with money. I think her next one, or her previous one, honestly, like I said, I'm kind of like blanking on the order of the movies. Yeah, I think it was her next one, Wendy and Lucy, which stars Michelle Williams, who's excellent. Nadia, have you seen Michelle Williams in anything?
What could I have seen her in? What else has she been in?
Off the top of my head, Manchester by the Sea. She was in that. Not that wasn't like a starring role for her, I guess. I'm looking at, she was in The Greatest Showman. She was in Venom. Nothing but the hits. No, she's like a very like good independent actor, is like Academy Award nominated actress, winner of many awards, and I'm acting like she's like a B movie actress by only listing The Greatest Showman and Venom. No, she was in like Blue Valentine. Gosh, what else? Yeah, she's been on Broadway. She's a great actress. But anyway, so she's the lead in this movie, Wendy and Lucy. She is Wendy. Lucy is a dog. And so Wendy is essentially homeless. Um, and so the movie kind of like follows her path throughout. More like a lot of Kelly Reichert's movies tend to fall more in Western United States, which is interesting because Kelly is from Florida, I believe. And I think it's only her first movie, River of Grass, that takes place in Florida. Most of her later work takes place in like the Midwest, and then several take place in Oregon. Um, but yeah, Wendy and Lucy is like in the West, and it's kind of I think of Kelly Reichardt as like one of a handful of like kind of like architects of the modern Western. I don't know. I think of a lot of her movies as Westerns, which I think Westerns like are often thought of as like, gunslinging cowboys and stuff. But I don't think it has to just be Westerns. I think that, the modern Western is in many ways more of a drama, and like more of a low key, like sad kind of reckoning with the West as it stands now. But yeah, Wendy and Lucy kind of like, you know, moves through that kind of like homeless, drifting lifestyle. It's a very, very bleak movie. Not a lot to be happy about in it. Not happy about as in terms of like whether it's a good movie, because it's a great movie, but never really like smile in it per se, unless it's about like Wendy and Lucy's relationship, which is adorable to watch. Um, Michelle Williams, she's been in several of Kelly's movies. I think the next one that she was in was Meek's Cutoff, which is a period film. It's like a more proper Western about a group of settlers moving west across the prairie and the Great Plains, trying to make their way to, some kind of like homesteading lifestyle. And so they wind up paying a man to take them there. And, that's where money comes into the movie. Like they put their lives in the hands of this guy. Michelle Williams also stars in Certain Women, which is probably my favorite of Kelly's movies. It's interesting, like structurally, because it's three different stories in one movie, like that exist independently of each other, except for the coveted Laura Dern crossover event that happens like 3/4 of the way through the movie. It's literally just a brief shot of Laura Dern in the background in like one of the other stories. She's the opening story, Laura Dern. She's like a lawyer. The second story is Michelle Williams, who's like a realtor kind of person. Third story is Kristen Stewart. And gosh, I'm blanking on this name now too. Third story, it's Kristen Stewart and Lily Gladstone, I believe. Yeah, Lily Gladstone. And so they all, like, I think Certain Women has much more to do with women than it has to do with money, but I think they're also very like closely tied in the movie. They all have to do with like women in these positions, like just being very lonely to some degree in their careers, in their personal lives, in everything. Laura Dern is like kind of like this like no nonsense lawyer who has a client, Jared Harris, who Nadia, are you familiar with Jared Harris?
I keep feeling like so embarrassed because I have to keep saying no.
No, he is excellent. I don't know if you've heard of the Chernobyl series that HBO did. He was the lead in that. Excellent.
Is he British?
Yeah,
Was he in Mad Men?
I have never seen Mad Men.
Give me the name again, could you?
Jared Harris.
Jared Harris. Oh my goodness. Okay, yes, I finally can say yes, I do know him. He was in Mad
Yeah,
Men. He played
yeah,
Lane Price, I believe. Ah, such a good actor.
yeah. He's. I mean, I love him dearly. In Certain Women, he plays one of Laura Dern's clients, and he winds up being very frustrated with his situation. He's like, if I remember right, he's being like kind of like screwed by some company he works for. Pretty much, he's trying to get like compensation for an injury, maybe. Um, and Laura tries her hardest with her lawyering, but she's not able to. So Jared Harris decides to take someone hostage. I think a security guard hostage in some archival building, I believe. And Laura Dern has to go in and talk him down. So it was an interesting twist that I just spoiled for people, but um, yeah, that was an interesting segment. The second segment of Certain Women um, is Michelle Williams, who is camping with her husband and their teenage daughter, who like a lot of teenage daughters, like doesn't like interacting with her parents. Um, and so like they are like a realtor couple too, which realtor couples just terrify me inherently to some degree. I think I don't know what it is. They're always so like efficient, and like that efficiency comes out here because their camping trip is also like a property visit, trying to like find out if they can like buy this material or something from this guy. And so it's like an older guy. And when she and her husband go into the house to like talk with him, he like pretty much only addresses the husband, not Michelle Williams. Even though like she's kind of like the lead of the pair in the business. And the third part is Kristen Stewart playing like a college student, like a forget what her some like liberal arts major, who's teaching like a law class in this tiny Midwestern town, for like pitiful wages. And it's because it's like pretty much the only work she can like scrape up that will like pay for her college. And Millie Gladstone is a local kind of like ranch hand, I guess you could say, watching over like a bunch of animals on a farm. And so she kind of like goes to the course and kind of like takes an interest in Kristen Stewart. And like there's like I think an implied like romantic interest from Millie to Kristen, but I think it could also be taken as, friendship interest because Lily is portrayed as like very lonely, where her only interaction is like cows and horses. Um, but I think it's more likely that it's like a romantic interest. That was how I read it while I was watching it. But yeah, so that like touches on money too. Her latest, Kelly's latest movie, First Cow, which fantastic name. Love the titular cow. That is probably her most upfront about money movie since Wendy and Lucy. She says like pretty directly that it's about capitalism. It's another period movie, although part of it takes place in the present. It's mostly a period movie about a fur trapper and a Chinese immigrant who wind up going into business together, making these like oily cakes using the milk from the first cow in the Oregon Territory. And so it's like very much about capitalism. It's very much about like exploiting both the cow and also how, those settlers were exploited. It kind of opens with uh, Cookie, the fur trapper, involved in the fur trapping business, but then, it's kind of like fur trapping died out fairly quickly in the West. And so, he's kind of like experiencing that. Um, but yeah, it was a really good movie. And it dealt mainly with capitalism, also with male friendship between Cookie and I believe King Lu was the name of the Chinese immigrant, and so they wind up growing very close to each other. I think again you could also like view it as a romantic relationship too, or just straight up friendship one. But they do die more or less intertwined with each other. It's suggested, so I think more likely romantic relationship maybe. But yeah, so that one, I don't know if I really like that. This was a very like brief overview of Kelly Reichert's filmography, which I think is a very interesting one to watch. I don't know if those sound interesting to you. A lot of her movies are like classified as like slow cinema, um, like they're very like deliberate, slow moving movies without, like intense action or anything like that. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on like what Kelly Reichert's movies sound like to you?
Well, I will say I remember distinctly, I don't know when First Cow came out exactly, but I remember reading a review of it. I forget exactly where, and I was thinking to myself, what like an interesting sort of plot line or concept. I just like I can still recall like being like, wow, after I read it. But she sounds like a really fascinating director, and I'm kind of again embarrassed that I have to say I have never seen any of her work. But I think you've convinced me to give her films a look. And what you said about her being like you said her films are like more on the slow side. I'm kind of paraphrasing you there. I don't know if I'm doing that accurately. I just don't think that like films always need to be super exciting, like how you describe Towering Inferno, to drive that message home, especially if it's in the realm of economics.
Yeah. So the next movie I wanted to talk about, I also became obsessed with over quarantine. I watched it kind of like not really meaning to. It was on the Criterion channel, which, little side note, I think everyone should have a Criterion channel subscription. It's done more to like expand my tastes in movies than anything. And also a big plus for me is that it's curated by real people and not algorithms that just kind of like spit out the next thing for you to watch. Anyway, so this was part of a collection of movies starring Burt Lancaster that was about to leave the channel because, you know, like all streaming services, what it has on offer rotates out every so often. Uh, and so I had one day left to watch the movies in the collection, in the Burt Lancaster collection. And so I read the like synopsis of the swimmer that they had on the channel, and I was like, huh, sounds interesting. And so I watched it, and I was obsessed. I immediately wound up. So the swimmer is based on a short story by John Cheever, who I'm planning on actually, you know what, I'm going to make a note to buy stories by John Cheever, the bigger collection of his short stories, because I also love the short story that it was based on of the same name, The Swimmer. So The Swimmer stars Burt Lancaster, obviously, as the titular swimmer. He plays a man who had, like, the way the movie starts is, you know, just amazing to me on its own. It starts with the camera like traveling through these trees, like a wooded kind of estate, coming upon a swimming pool, like a gorgeous looking in-ground swimming pool. And you're looking at the back of Burt Lancaster, and he like dives into the pool, and then the camera kind of like lowers itself, and he like kind of like rises out of the water, and a hand reaches down like over in front of the camera with a drink and like hands it to Bert, and he takes a drink and he like gets himself out of the water. And I just think it's like such a like interesting opening shot. Like it's just so like it just like throws you right into it like in a way that I really like. And so the movie, like more generally, yeah, Bert plays this man, Ned Merrill, who's, you know, this very like obviously well off man. Like he's very fit. He has the body that I dream of having. In that he's not like, you know, like incredibly muscular, but he's just very like fit and like very like, you know, like not dad bod, but like kind of like getting to that zone. And so he plays this guy Ned Merrill, and so when the movie starts, he's like kind of like at this group of his friends in this like gorgeous looking neighborhood. He's at their backyard, kind of like talking to them, and so his friends are like having this like kind of discussion on different things, like pointless things about you know pointless suburban topics, and Ned is like looking off at this like gorgeous backdrop of like all these backyards and all these fields and all these trees and forests behind him. And he kind of like turns and like interrupts them, and he like says that he thinks that he can swim all the way home. And so, you know, his friends are like, you know, what are you talking about? Like, there's no body of water between here and there. And so, like, Ned kind of like points towards the swimming pool, and he says, I can swim from pool to pool. And so it's just like pointless thing to like even suggest. And his friends like are like, you're dumb. Like that's very, very weird. And so Ned kind of like ignores them, and he immediately takes off. And so the movie is just him kind of like journeying from pool to pool. And it like takes on this like bizarre, almost like Dante's Inferno kind of thing, where every pool he goes to, he meets like or revisits like different people each time. There's one pool where it belongs to this old elderly couple who happen to be nudists, and so he winds up like stripping down to comply with their rules. And it doesn't like show anything. It's like all like very like carefully like constructed to like hide any like you know private parts behind like you know drinks and stuff. But he like winds up like meeting like a couple old friends from the workplace. He winds up meeting this like random kid just sitting in an empty pool. Um, and it's this like colorful cast of characters, and they all like you know have like just the most pointless things about suburban life to discuss. And, every pool he swims through, you learn more about Ned himself. You learn like more about his like loving wife, his beautiful home, his adoring daughters, and he like has this very like superficial connection to all the people he meets. It never seems like he actually cares about them. It also never really seems like they care about him per se. It's all like kind of like this very like flimsy facade of like suburban wealth. Like just everywhere you look, it's just wealthy people doing wealthy things, not really caring about anything other than like how their wealth makes them look. And so, Ned is at this point where he's not really like caring about it as much anymore, at least so he thinks. Because he's doing this weird thing where he's like swimming from pool to pool, so he like does not care what other people think about him. Um, but as this is you know more of a spoiler, I don't know if I should even say it, so you can like skip the next minute if you really want to.
Hey, we did a disclaimer. It's okay. You can
Yeah,
spoil if you want to.
yeah. So as he gets closer to his home, which you never see prior to the end, as he gets closer to his home, more of the facade starts to like kind of like peel away. There are more like pointed questions asked of him by the people he meets. There's like a couple who um, asked if he's like doing okay after what happened, and so he kind of like brushes it off, like pretending that he doesn't know what he talks about. He like winds up kind of like washing up, so to speak, at this pool party, and he sees like this like, hot dog cart, like one of those like old hot dog carts that he says belongs to him, and he gets like very mad at the host of the party because he says it belongs to him. And so the hosts are like getting mad too, and they're like, no, we bought it. And so he's like confused because they say that his wife sold it to them. And so he like starts to get more and more confused, and his last stop is at a public pool. And so like this public pool is like incredibly crowded. Like there's a shot of him like coming up out of the water after like swimming through all these like bodies and like gross murky water, and he looks like exhausted, not just from his journey but from like being in like the unwashed masses. And he like finds some more friends that like aren't really as friendly as he expected them to be. They're like obviously more like from like a middle class background, and they like ask these kind of like teasing questions of him, like asking if he like finally like decided to like come like slum it with them at the public pool. He's like asking like what they're talking about, and one of them asks if he's gonna like ask to borrow money again or something. And so like you as a viewer, you're like, what are they talking about? And so Ned gets so flustered, and he like makes the last journey back to his house. He's like climbing through like the woods and stuff, and the sky is getting like darker, and it starts to rain. And he like makes his way back to the house, this like beautiful mansion where it would be if it wasn't like so like run down looking. And so the gates are locked, and he's like trying to like make his way in, and he winds up like climbing over, and he like makes his way to the window, and he's like calling out, trying to find his family, who he said were like playing tennis at their courts. Tennis courts are bare and covered with leaves and stuff. And he like it ends the movie with him in the mansion, like realizing that he like made up everything, and it becomes obvious that the family left him a while ago, and he like was pretending that he was still rich, and he still had all these like suburban dreams and stuff. And it's just like a wildly interesting movie. Like I love the poster for it. I think Nadia, I think you should look it up right now too. Yeah, it's just this bizarre, like distorted look of Burt Lancaster, and the tagline is probably my favorite tagline ever. It's, when you talk about the swimmer, will you talk about yourself? And it's just like the most like alluring tagline to me ever. Like with the Towering Inferno, it kind of like draws you into like being involved in the movie, and it's just so interesting to me. It quickly became like one of my favorite movies. Um, it's just a great movie. Burt Lancaster is great in it. The director Frank Perry does a great job. The short story it's adapted from, that's worth reading too. There are some differences made, but both of them are like just excellent. And it's just like I'm so interested in suburban America, because that's where I grew up, like a small suburban neighborhood, and just that whole like suburban like facade that the swimmer portrays, where everyone's like being so fake about everything, and just all like these lies about wealth and about status and stuff. And the swimmer so like effectively skewers it all and brings it all like crashing down around Burt Lancaster's character. It's just, such a good movie. That's probably the movie I was most excited to talk about for this episode, because it's just so entertaining to me, so interesting to me. Yeah, I don't know if you had any thoughts. I've been talking at you for a while now, so I figure I should probably like turn it back to you.
So are you telling me that the swimmer starts off shallow, but ends up being pretty deep? See the pun
Yeah,
there?
I
Do you see the
guess.
pun there?
Yeah, I didn't really
I'm
want to,
horrible. I'm
but
sorry. Please don't fire me from
yeah.
Mosaic.
Yeah.
It'd be fair if you did, but just don't. It sounds really like it's like a really original plot. I mean, I would not, based on how you were describing the beginning and just the central plot, I would not have expected that ending, which is a really basic observation, as it's probably supposed to be a twist. But what year was this made? Do you
This
know?
was 1968. So
1968.
the year of release is actually something interesting to bring up too, because it was very like the 60s had a lot of, very, I think what you would think of like quintessential suburban vibes in a way, like a lot of media coming out that was like life is fantastic, coming off of like the excellent 50s. And so like the 60s are, the stuff starts, being like weird for Americans, but the 70s is where people really start, like Watergate and all that, is where people really start being like, damn, America, like what is happening? And like Vietnam, obviously, and stuff. But yeah, the swimmer like 1968. And so the short story was 1964, which is interesting too, because that was closer to like that kind of like Americana, like almost like, I guess, masturbatory, like American fantasy of the suburbs. And John Cheever kind of like, like ended that in a way. But like it not ended it as like the end all be all. I think there's a lot of like steps along the way, but the swimmer coming out in 1968 is interesting because it's like kind of like more of that trend towards like not satire movies per se, and that haha funny, but like movies that are more willing to like take a hard look at American life, and specifically American middle class, upper middle class, lower end of wealthy life. Because Ned Merrill, all of his neighbors, maybe they're wealthy by today's standards, maybe like wealthy compared to like certainly a lot of other people, but they're not living in these like massive. Maybe it was a stretch for me to call it a mansion, because it really like wasn't a mansion. It was like what you might think of as like a middle class homes. And that's what the neighborhood was like. They could just afford it because things were going good for them, because they were all like, pretty well off, like good job, white people from good backgrounds. So yeah, the year of release, that's a good thing to point out.
So Danny's given me permission to talk at him for a bit. I wanted to touch on Parasite, directed by Bong Joon-ho. Just an incredible film. I could probably do like a 30-part podcast series on all the aspects of this movie. And when I was researching before this, I just went down like a rabbit hole of analyses of this movie, and I'm not even sure if I've climbed out of it yet. There is just so many fascinating aspects of this film. It's really, in my opinion, marked by its intensity. It's a very slow climb to just a crazy climax. I personally like went into the movie not knowing what to expect at all, and I was completely blown away at the end. And I don't think I've stopped thinking about it since like the 5 months ago. Like I've watched it. So without a doubt, this film centers on class conflict. It's can be boiled down to the Park family, who are wealthy, and the Kim family, who are poor. The Kim family infiltrates the Park family home. The son poses as a tutor. I think the mother poses as a housekeeper. The daughter poses as an art therapist, and the father poses as a driver. And there are really, like as I said before, a ton of fascinating analyses and many monetary themes in this movie. Just to name a few, there's the relegation of cultures to commodities, as we see with the park's youngest son, Da Song's infatuation with Native American themed toys. Then there's the literal and metaphorical depictions of the upper class as being on top, since the Park family's home is in this elevated area with all this access to sunlight and wide open green space, and the lower class as being literally beneath them, as the Kim family's home is in a basement of a building. There's also sort of a theme which Bong Joon-ho actually touched on, I think, in his movie Snowpiercer, which I personally have not seen, but I heard it's also very good as well, and also
It
deals
is.
with themes of class.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, Danny
It
can
is.
vouch for that. And in this one as well, he talks about divisions among members of the lower class as they struggle to sort of escape either the situation or just to survive. And there's also the illusions of social mobility. And one particular theme I've come across in researching the film is that director Bong Joon-ho was actually trying to make a very specific statement regarding the disproportionate effects of climate change on different classes, with lower classes being more severely affected by the byproducts of it. As we see during the film's like huge rain scene, when the Park family home is not affected by the rain at all. In fact, I believe they just sort of watch the rain outside their big, pretty glass windows, whereas the Kim family home, which, as I've said before, is in a basement, is just completely flooded and completely destroyed. And this sort of disproportionate effect, specifically as it relates to the movie, is made all worse by the fact that the day after the flood, the Park family is just totally oblivious to what's happened the previous night, to not just the Kim family, but a ton of other people who've been affected by the huge rainstorm. They've been driven out of their homes, forced to live in a shelter. And the Park family is just more concerned with putting on like a birthday party for their son because the weather is so nice the next day. And there's a couple motifs throughout the film. One is the motif of smell. Multiple times throughout the film, there's discussion of how poor people smell, and just not even subtle attempts on like the part of the Park family specifically to like conceal their disgust at how the Kim family smells. And I don't want to be mean and spoil it, but this whole notion of like not being able to stand how another person smells as a result of circumstances that are out of their control is what kind of contributes to, I'll just say, it's a total bloodbath at the end. There's also a really interesting motif of staircases, which is also kind of, I believe, meant to reflect social mobility and division among classes. You will see, if you watch it, I recommend you do, throughout the film, that there's a ton of depictions of like family members running up and down staircases as well. In one analysis I came across, they point out how the Park family home is just filled with staircases, which sort of alludes to that theme of social mobility, going up, going down. So, Danny, do you want to jump in with my very choppy analysis of the film, as I'm sure you could do it probably more justice?
Yeah, I mean, I loved the movie. I've seen it, I think, 4 times now. I saw it first with my parents. It was when it was still Delaware isn't really good at getting like those kinds of not super. I mean, Parasite obviously became very mainstream very quickly for good reason, but it's not good at getting those like initially not mainstream, particularly international movies. Um, Very quickly, like as quickly as like actually like major metropolitan cities like New York and LA, even like Philly or something, which is where I had to go to watch it. I could have waited like another week for it to premiere in Delaware, but I did not want to wait another week, so I went to a theater in Philly with my parents, and so it was my Ma, I'm sure she's seen an international movie before at some point or another. It was probably her first South Korean film. It was my dad's second, because we had watched Train to Busan, which I'm not sure if you've seen. Yeah, that was really good. I showed him that, and he really enjoyed it. And so they both loved Parasite so much that they've shown it to like I think 2 other sets of friends, which is you know very rare. I mean, they generally like whenever we watch movies. Usually we'll all end up liking it, but it's very rare for them to love a movie so much that they immediately like seek out other people to show it to. But so yeah, that's kind of besides the point. So I saw it in Philly first, and then I've seen it several times since. And yeah, I mean, like you said, it has like a lot of meaning behind it. I think a lot of it, like what I was saying with 2012, like being very in your face about it, I think that Bong Joon-ho is similarly very unsubtle with his themes. I think that, like I was saying with 2012, like sometimes it's very much worth it to be unsubtle. It does kind of like, it's kind of funny when people are like saying they're trying to like talk. I think people too often like equate being subtle with being good inherently. And I think it's kind of funny to me like when people are like talking about Parasite and being like, oh, it's so like subtle with the themes and stuff. And I'm like, well, it's not like the rich people live above ground, the poor people live below ground. Like that's not like terribly subtle, but it's also very effective at getting the point across. And I don't say it's like unsubtle as like a dig against it. I think it's like an advantage of Bong Joon-ho's style. Like Snowpiercer, which you mentioned, is very much a class conflict story, like Parasite. Probably even less subtle than Parasite, because it's literally a class conflict, the poor versus the rich, but it takes place entirely on a train, which, you have a movie on a train, it's going to be cool in some way or another. Maybe I just like trains too much, but um, yeah, Snowpiercer was a good movie. Parasite was a very good movie. Like you said, like you hit, I think you hit on most of the aspects of the class and money themes. Yeah, I think there has been like some criticism um, of the movie that like director Bong like kind of portrays the Kim family, who are the poor family in the movie, as like being like bad people or something. And it's kind of hard for me to like understand. I mean, I guess to some degree, I can like I can understand like most analyses in a way of movies, but it's hard for me to like fully like back it because it's I don't really see it as like a movie necessarily about either one of the families, more about like the system in which they live, which I mean, it's called Parasite for a reason, and I think the first like thing people say about the movie is like, you know, neither of the families are parasites. Capitalism is the parasite, and like, yeah, like true, like that's the observation like you're supposed to make, I think, but I think that kind of like robbing the poorer family of that kind of like benefit of the doubt, maybe. I don't know if that's like a good way to say. I don't think that Bong like portrays them as evil, or like doesn't do a good enough job of portraying the rich people as evil. Um, I think
It's
that he
really
did. Yeah,
I'm
yeah. Sorry,
sorry.
go
It's
ahead.
just it's really funny that you mentioned that because I can't quote it from memory, but I came across a statement from him, from the director, and he mentioned something, if I remember correctly, that the film isn't intended to portray what's good or what's bad per se. It's a very interesting statement. I recommend both you and anyone who's listening to go read it if you want to really get a good analysis of what the film's intent. So I just think I understand what you're saying when you question, like, well, are they really bad people? But I just think that spurs a whole debate, which really says a lot about the complexity of the film and its themes.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's a good movie to talk about. I think that stylistically it was really really well done too. I haven't seen all of Bong's films. I've seen Snowpiercer and The Host, and I believe that might be it. No, Okja. I saw Okja too. All of his movies deal with money to some degree, or at least most of his movies deal with money and class to some degree. Um, I think Parasite probably is the most in your face about it. I think there's also, the South Korean angle of it too. I think that like a lot of American viewers like tend to and he like expected it. I've read like many interviews with him where he knew that it would be like a wide release and that countries would kind of like imprint on it for their own set of circumstances. I think a lot of it is very uniquely South Korean too. There's a lot about like South Korean like job market and stuff with the Kim's son like trying to, and the daughter for that matter, trying to find jobs after graduation, but that being impossible. Um, I think that I think that international movies are always very interesting to me when they deal with like class implications, because the class situation is very different in between countries, especially with like countries in the East. Well, uh, East and West are so like weird to like term countries, because I feel like any country can be in the West or East, because now it's more of like a philosophical standpoint than geographical. But that's besides the point. Yeah, I think that Parasite is an interesting movie. I think that, and a good movie. That's my concluding thought. Another South Korean movie that came out somewhat recently that I really wound up loving is Burning, directed by Lee Chang-dong. Um, it was a very good movie. That it was 2018. I think it's on Netflix right now, so it's pretty accessible if you have Netflix, or you can just get a free trial. Um, but Burning is kind of a psychological thriller, kind of like same intensity vibes as Parasite in a way, also very centered around class and money, but with kind of like a like obsessive personality hinge like tint to it. Burning is it's I don't really want to spoil too much. I guess it's kind of hard to spoil it in a way. It's based on actually two short stories, based on a short story that's based on a short story. Um, so the movie is based on a short story called Barn Burning, that is written by, um, shoot, he was a Japanese author, I believe. Yeah, Haruki Murakami, based on a short story by him, Barn Burning, which itself is based on a short story called Barn Burning by William Faulkner, I believe. And so the short stories follow, actually, no, they don't really follow the same story at all. The first one by Faulkner, that one was, it was kind of about like this boy's father, like this poor Southern boy whose father, like, he like burned down someone's barn, I think. And so the boy like kind of like winds up like witnessing the town like exact its punishment on his father. Um, Barn burning by Murakami was, what the movie was based on, and that one and the movie I'll specifically talk about the movie synopsis. It's kind of like a recent college graduate, so kind of like Parasite. He finds himself meeting a friend from high school, I think, who he kind of like becomes, low-key obsessed with. If not in a romantic way, then at least in like a friendship, kind of like longing for some kind of connection way. And so, after like, getting to know each other more, she winds up, and I guess I should say who plays these characters, which I might butcher the pronunciations. Yuain plays the guy, Yu, and Jian plays Amy, the girl that he winds up being obsessed with. And so Yu kind of like he grows more and more infatuated with her, and Hamey winds up going on a kind of like vacation kind of thing to Africa of all places. And so when she comes back, she meets up with you again, but it turns out that she has a new friend, Ben, played by Stephen Yoon, who is great in this movie. He like got his like first big break with The Walking Dead, playing Glenn. Now he's getting much more film roles and like bigger and bigger film roles. I think he was just recently nominated for Best Actor, which is great. But yeah, so Ben is kind of strange. He's like very like clearly like this kind of like upscale, wealthy young guy with money to burn and like a lot of boredom. And Hamey is like kind of like in the same way that Yu is infatuated with her, she's infatuated with Ben. And Ben's kind of like more of like an aloof person, kind of like he cares, but he doesn't really care. And so the plot kind of like hinges on you being like more weirded out by Ben's relationship to Hamey, because on the one hand, like if he can't have her, then like no one can. But if Ben's gonna have her, then he should appreciate her. And Yu is, not wealthy by any means. He has like kind of like whatever job he can take. I think at one point he like tries to work in like kind of like a warehouse kind of thing, but he like pretty much walks off immediately because he can't do it. Um, and so it got kind of like very much like a class disparity on display. Hamey is like attracted to that kind of like wealthy lifestyle. Ben kind of like doesn't know the privilege that he has in that wealthy lifestyle, and Yu is painfully aware that he does not have that wealthy lifestyle. And it gets more into like the psychological thriller zone when Hamey kind of like drops off the face of the earth. Um, Yu like called her pretty regularly, and then suddenly she doesn't pick up. He drops by her apartment. The landlady says that, she hasn't been there in a while, and more than that, like all of her stuff seems to be in the apartment. He talks to Ben. Ben says that she hasn't dropped by in a while either, and so I'm kind of mis-explaining the key plot point, the weirdest part of the movie, the part that is what the movie is based on from the short story, adapted from the short story. So I'm not sure where it was in the movie, but at a certain point, the three of them have like kind of like a party at Yu's house, which is kind of like on the outskirts of town in a way. It's like an old kind of farmhouse that he's kind of embarrassed of Hamey and Ben, especially Ben, probably both of them equal amount of them seeing. And so, they get high, they get kind of drunk, and Hamey's dancing for them. And when she goes in to sleep, Ben and Yu are kind of like sitting watching the sunset, and Ben makes like a bizarre confession that sometimes for fun, when he feels like it, he goes out and burns down greenhouses or like other dilapidated, abandoned structures. And Yu is kind of like what? Because it's like, like that's like a bizarre thing to do in your spare time. And so Ben's like, yeah, I do that. And it's just, like a very like nonchalant confession, like as if it's something that everyone does. And so for the remainder of the movie, like he becomes kind of obsessed with the barn burning, the act of the barn burning, and he like winds up like going to every greenhouse in the area constantly to make sure that Ben, hasn't struck again. And at one point, Ben tells him, I burned another greenhouse last night, and he was like, "Where?" And so Ben just says, close by, like to your house, implying near Yu's house. And so Yu's like, "Okay." And so, that kind of like brings in a more sinister connotation when Hamey disappears without a trace. Um, it's a very interesting movie the way it unfolds. It's kind of like a slow burning, and it very much like plays on the like class disparity between the characters involved. The barn burning or greenhouse burning, I guess, is like another kind of like just like Ben's lack of not maybe not lack of awareness,
Like remorse,
but
maybe?
yeah, he's just so detached from like reality that he kind of like just does stuff for the fun of it. With you, everything's very calculated for him. Like he has that farmhouse because it was left to him by his dad, and he's like trying to find a job, and he's like so attached to Hamey because she like shows him some kind of attention. Everything's very like not logical because he's very obsessive with what he does, but obsession has a degree of logic, I think. Whereas with Ben, he's just I don't know the exact medical definition of like psychopath or sociopath, so I don't know if I should call him that, but I think he's some kind of path, maybe. Like he's just a very like I don't know, everything he does is so sinister, and Stephen Yeun does such a great job portraying that. A lot of it has to do with the class stuff. Yeah, I don't know if you had any thoughts on that.
I don't know. The whole plot just sounds very unnerving, if you will.
Mm,
I've actually never heard of this movie before you told me about it. Um, I don't know, just wanting to burn empty buildings. It's just, where does that come from? It just seems to come out of nowhere. It's just a very interesting sort of plot element to me. You're talking about so many movies that I need to watch now. I have to add them to my list. My list is going to be like 3 miles long.
yeah, well, that's a net positive, I think.
So this brings us to our next and final film for this episode, The Florida Project, 2017 film directed by Sean Baker. The film primarily focuses on a mother, Haley or Hallie. Okay, I need to. It's spelled Halley. Is that Hallie or Haley?
I think it's Haley. I think it was pronounced Haley, but I can't
It was
remember.
pronounced Haley. Yeah, unfortunately. I'll just say Haley. And her daughter Mooney, living in a motel over the span of one summer in Kissimmee, Florida. Hope I'm pronouncing that correct as well, which is not too far from Disney World. So we see the adventures of the daughter as well as the struggles of the mother. And it's overall just a very heartbreaking story, made all the more poignant, personally, in my opinion, by its cinematography. It's sort of depicted as this pastel, candy colored place where people are just struggling to make it in their daily lives. Most of the events of the film take place at Magic Castle Inn and Suites, which is actually a real place. And it's just very interesting because the mother and the daughter can't afford to go to Disney World and the real Magic Castle, and they still take it day by day in a Magic Castle. That's a horrible way of putting it. I'm sure the director meant it to be a lot more poignant than the way I just worded it. I just thought it was just a very interesting irony. One important element of the film that I remember specifically, which kind of shows how housing works for these people who live there, is that legally the residents can't establish a permanent residence at the motel. So they have to work around this loophole by moving to another hotel briefly once a month. We also see trucks come to the motel that carry free food for the residents. And although Mooney's having fun with her friends, regardless of how bleak the environment may be, she's growing up in a place where people struggle financially. We see fights break out in the area, and there's even a potential pedophile in a certain scene that the kids encounter. So, all through this, the children are really oblivious to the financial struggles, which really puts the film specifically from the perspective of a child, which makes the film so striking because you're really seeing things from Mooney's and her friend's viewpoint as opposed to the adults. We see what's happening to the adults, all the things they have to go through, but it's still from that mindset of like a child. So Haley and Mooney are surrounded by a tourist industry as they go about their days, as they are near Disney World. So there's specifically scenes where we see Mooney and her friends just passing by those big, tacky gift shops, as well as grocery stores and ice cream parlors where they spend a lot of their days like asking just for change so they can buy an ice cream cone to share. We also see Haley in the meantime trying to find a steady source of income. One plot point is that after she loses her job as an exotic dancer, she becomes ineligible for federal assistance and therefore resorts to selling perfume to tourists in parking lots. This leads to a ton of trouble for her and Mooney, who she often brings along. She gets free food from her friend who works at a diner, but she still struggles to make ends meet and she turns to sex work. And at one point actually steals one of her clients' magic bands to Disney, which I actually had to research. I wasn't sure what those are, but they're like bracelets that actually contain your ticket to Disney World, and she sells them. So this, along with a fight Haley has with her friend, ultimately leads her to being investigated by the police, and Mooney being put in foster care. So really a sad ending. And I just remember specifically the last scene where the both Haley and Mooney are like together and just really happy, like we would expect a mother and daughter to be. Is they sneak into a hotel breakfast, which I thought was just a really interesting way of like depicting their last time together. And we know that Haley really loves Mooney, and but although we don't really know Haley's background story, how she grew up, where she's from, it's fair to assume that she grew up in a similar environment, the similar unstable environment that Mooney's living in right now, and just doesn't really know how to make ends meet. And I think one of the most probably I would argue like famous parts of the movie, or the one that's specifically garnered a lot of attention, is the ending. So after Mooney's separated from her mother, she runs away from child services and goes to her friend Jancy, who lives at a different motel called Futureland, and they run away together to Disney World. And this scene was very interesting in particular, I read, because it was shot on an iPhone. They actually
Mm-hmm.
had to sneak into Disney World to film it. And the ending kind of threw me off at first. I remember like after the movie ended, just being a little confused, to be honest. I just wasn't expecting that at all. And the movie isn't light at all per se, notwithstanding its serious themes. I mean, it deals with a lot of serious themes, but things got super intense at the end. And I think this escape to Disney World really drives the point home. I can't tell if it's purely symbolism or just maybe like a representation of what's going on through Mooney and Jancy's head as they say their goodbyes to each other, or if they somehow really ended up in Disney World at the real Magic Castle. I'm going to assume that it's one of the former. But I think a lot of us associate the magic of Disney with a sort of escape, no matter what that ending was supposed to mean. But it's an escape that's, starts at $109 a day. So sorry to like get a little heavy there. But director, what's really interesting about this film, I think, from among the ones we've discussed today, is director Sean Baker has actually stated that the film is meant to raise awareness and spur action regarding issues of housing. So he was really trying to send a financial message in this film. And I did a little research. And according to US Census Bureau data, as of July 1st in 2019 in Kissimmee, where the film takes place and was filmed, the percent of persons in poverty is about 25%, 23.6%. And compare that to the 2019 national poverty rate of 10.5%. So that's just a very interesting context to put the film in. They've interviewed some residents of the Magic Castle Inn and Suites, and the residents have said that like some of the things depicted in the movie aren't entirely accurate as to what they personally go through in their daily lives, but there's still issues in that realm that need to be addressed, they think. So I, again, just spoke at Danny for a long time just now, and he's been waiting very patiently. So, Danny, do you have anything you'd like to add?
I think you summed it all up pretty well. I love the ending. It threw me for a loop too, but I think I don't know. I haven't really thought a lot about whether it was like real or just metaphorical. Um, I don't really know that I need it to be either. I think what interested me most was it being Disney World, like like where uh, Haley and Mooney live. It sounds like like one of the magic lands at Disney. Futureland sounds like Tomorrowland. And they all, I mean, it's all like very like even in real life, those places are like designed to kind of like crib on Disney style and aesthetic. But I thought it was really interesting how much they tied it to Disney and like those aesthetics because I think to me and to a lot of people, Disney is like a symbol of wealth in a way, not only as like some like corporate powerhouse, but like just by the act of being able to go there, because like you said, like starting at like hundred and something dollars a day for the tickets, which get extremely expensive extremely quickly.
Yeah, the
Um,
magic bands themselves, I got very curious on what note these are. They can cost upwards of like $45 if you want that
mm,
special edition sort of
so yeah,
like
my mom
character
ordered
theme.
us some Magic Bands. We've been to Disney a few times. Yeah, the Magic Bands are cool. Um, Disney as a corporation is not, I should say. But yeah, I enjoyed the movie a lot. I thought that Brooklyn Prince was phenomenal in it, as was the oh shoot, I forget what her name
William
was now.
of
Yeah,
William
yeah, yeah,
Dafoe
yeah. He
was
was great.
yeah,
And
he was
then
fantastic.
I think Bria Bree something. Gosh, I forget what it was now. Um, I'm looking that up. Sorry to all the listeners. Yeah, Bria Vinay. I'm not sure if that's how you pronounce it. Apologies to her. They were all very, very good in the movie. And yeah, like you said, like a lot of it, I liked how it was from Mooney's point of view for pretty much the whole thing, like only what she understood of her mother's circumstances, her circumstances, um, and everyone around her. I think that a lot of the movie was about like protecting Mooney's um, like worldview in a way. I think that the ending kind of like ties into that, like how she sees Disney World as like some like final victory or something over all the misfortune that she has in her like short life. Because I think that's what a lot of people view like stuff like that as like those status symbols as like kind of like some sign of winning over all of that. So yeah, good movie.
Yeah, and I for one like watching it, I really enjoyed it, but I think the message like really stuck with me a long time afterwards. Like in preparing the discussion of this film, like this really sent me on like a stream of deep thinking. So I think it's a very good movie.
All right, so that was pretty much all we had for our first episode. We don't really want to make it too long. We have another episode which might wind up being a little shorter, where we'll talk about science fiction and horror movies that we've seen that have to do with money, class, any of that kind of stuff. So yeah, again, I am Danny Zhang.
I'm Nadia Ellerhorst.
Yeah, and so we're editors at the review, talking about movies for you. Yeah, so that's all for now.